So welcome this afternoon. Hopefully you're here to see PowerShell because you're curious about it, and that's the idea of this talk, which is kind of an introduction to it. My name's Chris Oldwood. I've been a member of Accu for coming up for 15 years. Been to many Accu conferences. Always great. I've been a developer for 25 years or so, pretty much entirely kind of on Windows applications and services, and mostly sort of C++ and C# kind of more recently in the world of .NET for the last sort of 10 or so years. I've been a user of PowerShell right since the kind of the early days, since 1.0, and was even sort of following the blog during the kind of the pre-days before that, when it went by the name of Monad and the Microsoft Shell, because I sort of started to move away from GUI-based stuff kind of in the sort of some years into my career, and then started looking at doing more command line stuff, or getting kind of more involved in that. So that kind of piqued my interest. So Jeffrey Snover, who's the sort of lead architect of PowerShell, always likes to say that to ship is to choose. Unfortunately, we can't do everything, and we only have 90 minutes, so we are restricted on the amount of stuff we can cover in that time. I will do my best to cover what I think are interesting things, but ultimately the lens through which I'll be presenting is that of a developer. I am not a full-time system administrator or data scientist or any of those other kind of roles that that people have. I am mostly a developer, and I kind of generally involved in sort of deployment and build, test, that kind of scripting and kind of automation to that degree. I do some monitoring and some data analysis and some system administration on the side as part of my T-shaped persona, but that's it. It's kind of very much these are the things that I've generally kind of are my day-to-day, the stuff that affects me or that interests me kind of day-to-day. So that's kind of to give you some idea of perhaps what to expect. Why PowerShell? So I've split the talk into kind of a couple of sections. The first part is a bit of background material, which I think is important, possibly to head off some kind of preconceptions around what it exists, why it exists, that kind of thing. And then we'll kind of I'll fire up the REPL, and we'll kind of go through, and I'll go through some bits of it in a REPL, so you can see kind of how it works, and go through some kind of lots and lots of kind of examples and stuff, and we'll look at language basics and interop and things as we kind of go along. And then there's a kind of a little bit to finish at the end. So a little bit of kind of background and history. Cast your mind back, I guess, to the 90s, those of us who can. I started on DOS and Windows 3.0 professionally, so MS-DOS, command.com. Batch files was the automation of choice for Windows at that point, pretty much, in terms of command line. It wasn't particularly good. Lots of ugly tips and tricks and things that usually involved messing around with memory of other processors and stuff. But that was pretty much it until the sort of mid-90s, when Windows 95 and Windows NT 3 started to take off, and in the 32-bit world, command.com became command.exe, and it's had a tiny little bit of update since then, but fundamentally it's still pretty much the same thing, and very kind of weak from a kind of a automation kind of perspective and scripting language perspective. So one of Microsoft's answers to this was the active scripting engine, which kind of underpins ASP. The classic ASP, for those people who remember writing CGI scripts with IIS back in the 90s. There were a couple of different language plugins. You had VBScript, which is a Visual Basic dialect, and there was also JScript, which was a Microsoft sort of JavaScript kind of implementation, and effectively they could both run within the same engine. You had CScript and WScript as the two hosts. CScript for running stuff command line, WScript for running stuff in a kind of a GUI way. I think the intention was that you could run the script depending on which you felt most comfortable with, and the script would automatically adjust to either ask you messages at the prompt or pop up message boxes. But from what I can see, it generated more confusion than anything else. There was also, they were heavily COM based, so the way you interacted with the registry and the file system was through some COM objects, and if you wanted to extend it, then you had to write your own COM objects. So if you needed to configure DCOM and security and that kind of stuff, you could do it that way. But ultimately, utterly not composable at all. You couldn't pipe input from one to the other. In fact, if you, with the engine, certainly under VBScript, if you ended up shoving too much out of std error before reading from std out, the whole thing would lock up. So it was not the most, I didn't find it the most successful solution for writing CI stuff either, kind of back in the 90s. So all in all, not a particularly good experience for scripting and automation during the sort of the 90s. So fast forwarding to kind of 2002, well, just before that, a chap called Jeffrey Snover joined Microsoft from kind of IBM and kind of Deck Worlds, and he was tasked with working on a little project called WMIC, which is the Windows Management Instrumentation Console. WMI being an object-oriented based approach to managing machines. It itself being a realization of the web-based enterprise management, but I don't think anybody ever implemented that apart from Microsoft. It basically gave you kind of an LO, gave you objects for disks and memory and operating systems and processes, and you could have methods you can invoke. So this was it's great, and it's still used quite heavily today. And the WMI console and WMIC is still shipped with Windows because they generally don't throw anything away, so you can still have a play with that. But ultimately, it was a tool for querying stuff, and you see the kind of the early days of PowerShell kind of in there. At the same time, there was another team in Microsoft who were porting the Corn shell, I think it was, under the name Kermit, and these two things ended up kind of going together and creating a vision for perhaps how scripting and automation should work on Windows. And the result of that was this thing called the Monad Manifesto, because it went by the name Monad at that point, which is a 16-page document which you can still download. The link's at the bottom, but you can easily Google it, about the kind of the vision and the general idea of what PowerShell was to kind of to become. It's generally an easy read. It says that it's not a white paper or an architectural diagram, and that's fair enough. But ultimately, the ideas and concepts within it, it's well worth having a read if you want to understand kind of where it kind of came from, because I think most of those visions still hold true. I'd say there's a fair amount of it that's still true today. And as an outsider from Microsoft, it fits my mental model of PowerShell and kind of how it works and the problems generally that it solves. Obviously, there's some bits they didn't do, other bits they did, but I think still a very useful kind of introduction. So I've picked a few kind of quotes and sections out of it, which I think are the bits that, if you like, are the takeaways from that particular thing that kind of explain some of the kind of ideas. So one of the things that I think people who don't work a lot on Windows, for instance, often don't realise is the fact that a lot of people who do administration stuff within the world of Windows actually aren't programmers or systems administrators. They are just kind of normal people who happen to be a bit more technical than somebody else and are good at kind of working around problems and downloading tools and making that happen. So one of the goals of PowerShell is to kind of make it a little bit easier perhaps for those people who are shoved into the bits of kind of admin-y role and make it easier for them to kind of adopt. Then obviously conversely there is the those people who are perhaps Unix system administrators who have worked for a long time, and are au fait with the command line and tools and kind of how they work, and even kind of like composing them, and so it'd be ridiculous to alienate them in the way that they've kind of been alienated so far through the active scripting engine in kind of batch files. It's not a good environment to be on when you come from something that's pretty much so much sort of better. So if they get this right, then they'll end up kind of hitting the sweet spot of both groups and hopefully creating something that's really good, or they'll end up missing wildly on both and alienating an awful lot of more people. I think, or at least from my perspective, kind of sitting a bit more in that middle-ish kind of right of that group, I think they did it kind of works out the choices that they made. It's definitely better than what we had before by quite a long shot. Anybody who's ever written a command line tool will remember or will know that there's an awful lot of stuff that you end up doing that everybody else ends up doing as well. For instance, you have to pass command line arguments, you have to deal with kind of input encoding issues, print usage messages. Do you use single dashes, double dashes, forward slashes? What do you use to represent help? Is it a question mark, an H? Do you use equals and colons and stuff to attach variables, arguments to parameters, values? And then there's stuff about logging. So, for instance, writing to stood out, stood error, or if you're in C++, you could even use clog, for instance. And then, of course, in terms of output format, you might output some raw stuff, but then somebody's going to ask you to output stuff in JSON and XML or HTML. And so you end up implementing that kind of stuff as well. And even if you end up having to pull together, and there are libraries, and you can make use of those libraries, every app still ends up obviously importing a lot of those kind of behaviors. So there's a lot of duplication, which means you end up spending a fair bit of time testing stuff that actually isn't the kind of the logic, but is all of the framework that sits around your kind of process. So one of the things they wanted to do was to try and ameliorate that by providing some common framework. And the last option is trying to operate on remote machines. Again, that was done in kind of different ways. There's different protocols and stuff. So hopefully, kind of making that removing some of that, then would also make administration across wide farms, which of course was just growing and growing at that time, was going to become more of a kind of an issue, or more kind of important. Now, you might have heard a statement made about PowerShell that it traffics in objects, not in text. And that's kind of partly true. One of the issues with attaching stood out from one process to stood in on another and passing text is that effectively the only convention is that there are lines of text, possibly even kind of encoding as well. But ultimately, there's no kind of, it's treated as unstructured. You end up spending, if you want to make any sense of it, to sort of chop bits out and format in different ways, then you effectively have to do a lot of this parsing yourself, working out whether it's column 2 or column 3, and do you use a comma or a space as a delimiter, and that kind of stuff. So there's a lot of kind of hacking about and stuff to make things kind of work and provide. If you want to sort of compose a bunch of tools into providing a nice output, it's not particularly easy. There's a lot of fumbling around. So one of the things that they chose to try and do was to try and keep data as rich as possible, and then effectively allow that sort of richer data objects to be passed through pipelines, and then effectively do the rendering to different formats and stuff kind of at the end, so that everything sort of remains as possible. And we'll kind of see what that means kind of in practice. That doesn't mean that you can't just pipe in text. You certainly can. It just means that your object that you're piping is an array of lines of, effectively an array of strings, rather than an array of a richer kind of object type. So there's all the kind of interop support in there, because let's face it, there's an army of tools that do not have native PowerShell equivalents. Not that I think there was an awful lot of choice, but they needed reflection and kind of attribute-based stuff to realize some of the stuff, to try and make it easier for people to write commandlets for it. At the time, they were at war with Java. I think within a couple of years, I think Java was not allowed to even be shipped on Windows XP. So that was pretty much I suppose the other choice. So that was never really going to happen. .NET was sort of .NET 1. There was C# was kind of growing, and VB.NET. So I think it kind of naturally fit on that. And I think that sort of helped with the kind of cross-platform success that they kind of had later. I mean, the main thing that that sort of reflection aspect is something which shines all the way through, and you can kind of make use of that yourself. Even if there's stuff that you can't do natively in PowerShell, you've always got the option of writing something in C#, or even just at the REPL using the reflection abilities of .NET there and then to find stuff out and debug stuff. So I think it's kind of worked pretty well as an architectural choice. Version history. So we've, as I said, the manifesto was 2002. So we had a first kind of outing, I think, at PDC in 2003, beta 2005, and then finally it kind of sees the light of day in 2006. A key kind of adopter for this and driving force was the fact that the Exchange server and SQL Server releases that were around that time shipped a whole load of commandlets for admins to use. So there was, a real kind of drive through those, which were obviously popular kind of services that Microsoft provided. So you basically had administrators there that had to kind of adopt it pretty much as their choice. So I think that kind of helped with some of the success. And then PowerShell 2, which seemed to linger forever with kind of XP Vista and Windows 2003 because they were so they just went on forever. So PowerShell 2 always seemed to be the version that you ended up running on, despite the fact that you might be developing on Windows 10 with say 4 or 5. And then there's kind of refinements 3, 4, 5. At 2016, .NET Core was the inception of that, which was the sort of the cross-platform version of .NET, saw the light of day. And of course, with PowerShell sitting on top of .NET, if they could port that to .NET Core, then naturally PowerShell would become cross-platform. And effectively, that's kind of what's happened. So 2018, we have PowerShell Core, which is the cross-platform version, which has 6, 6.1, and 7, and then currently in preview is 7.2. They're just waiting for .NET Core 6, I think, before that kind of sees the light of day. What's interesting is that as of you'll see that from the original kind of lineage stops at 5 and 5.1. A decision was made that the original sort of Windows-oriented PowerShell, which was really just PowerShell with some Windows-specific features, which generally tended to be GUI-oriented. They weren't in the PowerShell Core product, but effectively they've kind of been reinstated now under another guise. So, for instance, out to grid view, which allows you to sort of have almost an Excel-style GUI view with filtering and stuff, has made a reappearance. As a consequence, there's now parity with the Windows 5.1, and so going forwards, that will stop, and PowerShell Core will be their version of choice. So the sort of cross-platform open source version will be their version going forward on their own platform. So again, sort of continuing part of the change and adoption of a more kind of open source kind of approach to things. As you can see, PowerShell Core is supported on a number of different platforms, classic Windows ones, 8 and 10, and various Windows Server versions, then macOS and various Linux distributions. They can be sold. So on Ubuntu, it's available as a snap, classic. So you'd have to install with snap install classic. Whereas on Windows, you can download PowerShell Core via Chocolatey, so Choco install PowerShell, and it sits side by side because it uses a slightly different process name, so you can run them both. And then I think Arch and Kali and Raspbian are community efforts, so Microsoft aren't directly supporting them, but they support the community who are porting versions of it. So again, kind of part of the new Microsoft thing is supporting other stuff as well. They clearly want it to be kind of successful. Don't think it's going to supplant the likes of Bash and stuff now, short term ever, but it's another alternative which for someone like myself who's currently doing a lot of Linux work but supporting Windows VMs, it provides another kind of admin route in. Tooling wise, I think Microsoft have generally been pretty good on the tooling front. It ships with originally with the REPL, which we'll kind of see in a bit. And that REPL will kind of give you a little bit of colouring and highlighting, so it's a little bit better than the bland old console that you're kind of used to. PowerShell ISE, which also shipped from the beginning, was kind of an IDE, and part of that trying to sort of reel in the less experienced kind of programmer sysadmin kind of users. It sort of provided a shell and editing capabilities, and then there was sort of help built in. You could debug stuff with a GUI. much like the kind of VBA style editor that you would see in Excel, for instance, for people trying to debug VBA. So if you're used to debugging VBA in Excel, there was sort of, somewhat of a kind of a parallel there. And it's, it still ships today, but it's kind of on the way out. Visual Studio adopted PowerShell as the package manager, so people got into it that way, and text editor support. VS Code, on the other hand, pretty much went straight in and added support for it as the default console. There's console integration, again, debugging. And ultimately, I think VS Code is now the replacement for PowerShell ISE. I don't know whether that's official or not, but I think it seems to be their efforts are going in that direction, which is fair enough because VS Code is a pretty decent editor and there's no need to keep ISE anymore. In terms of kind of bolt-on tools, if you're a Bash person and you've used shell check, or you're kind of used to using lints under JavaScript, that kind of thing, PS Script Analyzer is a linting tool. We'll pick out common mistakes, but also and other stuff around conventions and guidelines and stuff. So it's kind of a bit of a style-y cop type thing as well. And that comes, there's a plugin for VS Code, which is good to run. Pasta is a unit test framework that it's not something I've used much. I've kind of dabbled in it, but allows you to mock commandlets, particularly system commandlets, so you can effectively write unit tests for system administration style scripts. It's pretty good for that. PS Readline is a PowerShell version of Readline, so it allows you to more than just navigating back through and forwards through your history, can do some prediction around arguments and stuff and things under the covers, which kind of gives you a slightly nicer kind of experience on the command line, so you're not totally left kind of guessing. Even something a little bit better than the autocomplete even. Psarchy, often mistakenly called psake, because it's effectively a make tool. So in the vein of make and rake and fake and cake and the others, it's comes as a assembly with a little bit of PowerShell that sits on top, but it allows you to write tasks in PowerShell, somewhat similar to what you might use with, say, Gulp. And effectively, you can write sort of build script with that, although it's massively faster than the npm Gulp approach. I've replaced a few Gulp-based build scripts, npm approaches with Psarchy because it's far quicker in terms of runtime, and it provides bits for little hints for documenting commands and stuff and timing information, all kind of built in. So it's pretty good for that. And then lastly, you can't have a tool these days without a package manager. PowerShell Gallery was originally the coding kind of part, snippets kind of sharing thing, and I guess Chocolatey, now 10 years old, as a sort of package manager, they finally got around to Microsoft have finally added their own kind of one-get. So you have a package system for installing modules, but that kind of extends farther wide than PowerShell, but it makes things easier for installing stuff, for getting hold of bits and pieces that you need to perhaps talk to particular types of services or doing particular types of administration. So that's kind of the little bit of history. I'm going to pop on to language stuff now, fire up the REPL, and kind of go through sets of examples. So just to give you an idea of what I'm kind of going to go through, going to do some basic stuff, types, type accelerators, objects, calling .NET methods, look at some of the kind of the operators that they've got for string manipulation stuff. Commandlets, a term that's weird to PowerShell, nothing fancy, but give you some idea of what they're about, and the kind of the convention stuff that they provide. Functions, fairly obviously, and filters, which are a particular kind of function. And then we'll look at pipelines, because that's kind of the big part where looking at filtering, projecting values, grouping, that kind of stuff, and how you kind of output stuff, that bit. And then we'll take a brief look through the error handling kind of options. And then finally a brief look at sort of an example kind of script, just so you can kind of see what features you get specifically for around writing commandlets as effectively scripts, because that's kind of quite powerful as well. So let me switch to my new share, PowerShell. Okay, so hopefully you'll now see my PowerShell console here. Right, just bear with me a second so I can see. Right, so this is the PowerShell 7 PowerShell core, terminal, and like all good first programs, let's start with a simplest hello world going, which of course is just a string with hello world inside of it. A la bash, single quotes if you want to, unless you're going to do kind of for a kind of literal, whereas double quotes if you wanted to have control characters and string interpolation, that kind of stuff, which we'll look at a little bit later. One interesting thing at this point, backslash is not the escape character, it's a backtick in PowerShell, which is an interesting choice. There is a book that will tell you why that choice came about, but that's one of those sort of departures that they made. Obviously, we can do maths because it's a REPL, so nothing too exciting, usual kind of stuff, stick some parentheses in to change the order of evaluation, all that kind of stuff. So integers, so by default, so 42 would be interpreted as an integer, and that would be typed as an int, as in int32 in the .NET world. Depending on the size of kind of the literal, it will pick an int or a long or a decimal, and if it's huge, then basically it will get cast to a double. Now, you can use a type, so if for some reason you want to actually force a value to be a particular type for some reason, then you can use what's called a type accelerator, which is effectively a way of casting values. Obviously, the number still displays the same because there is no fractional part to display. We also have, I put literals in hex, and as of a fairly recent change, we can also use binary literals as well, which is kind of useful if you're doing some interop stuff and you've got flags and stuff to the Windows API. So that's kind of quite useful. One reasonably novel addition is units. So for instance, they have the most common, which is kilobytes, megabytes, gigabytes, terabytes, petabytes. Although I think, isn't it technically gigabytes because it's thousands? Anyway, because it's 1024 rather than millions and millions. But anyway, so you can say 1 GB and that will give you a gigabyte, which is handy if you have a large number and you want to know what, and you don't want to have to sit there and work out what a gigabyte is because you can't remember. So that's kind of a handy little shortcut for formatting disk spaces and that kind of stuff. Now, I'll just clear that out. An obvious question, I think, when you're dealing with scripting languages is what happens when you start doing odd things, like, for instance, can you do the addition of an integer and a string? Yes, you can. Effectively, it changes converts the string to an integer. Lo and behold, you get 4, whereas if the left-hand argument is a string, then you'll get string concatenation. Whether you like string concatenation, operator overloading, string concatenation, I'll let you decide. But I thought we'd moved away from it, but apparently it's still quite popular. So from an arithmetic point of view, 42 times 2 is that, whereas for a string, lo and behold, it does something which I think Python does, which is effectively to duplicate the string multiple times. It's not something I've ever done in practice, but I don't know. I think Kevin used it in one of his fizz buzzes, so I guess it's useful. We can create an array with just a comma-separated set of values. So there we go, 1, 2, 3, and you'll notice that effectively it gets the array gets displayed an item at a time on the output. And then naturally, if we can do addition of, there's no reason why we shouldn't be able to do an array addition. Effectively, it concatenates the two sequences together. And similarly, we can even duplicate like we did with values. Again, I say whether that's useful or not is up to you. If you wanted to create an empty array, then that's the syntax for an empty array. That comes in handy sometimes if you have a sequence and you need to force it into an array, because PowerShell collapses empty sequences into a null reference, which can catch you out if you then want to do some, you want to invoke methods on it, for instance. But generally speaking, you generally don't worry about it. So as a consequence, if I do this, then I don't expect the answer 3. Effectively, it is an array with 1 and an array with 2. I expect it to concatenate 2. So, okay, so that's arrays. Arrays obviously are generally useful and kind of behind the scenes as sort of sequences, but in terms of the structure that I think tends to get used most in PowerShell is hash tables. So I use the @ and curly braces to define a hash table. So this is a hash table with 3 elements in it, and you can see that it automatically displays as key value or name value pairs with ABC as the keys and 1, 2, 3 as the values. And the reason why they tend to be fairly pervasive is because there are various things where you can bundle up parameters into hash tables and then pass them into arguments, and they will be passed, effectively the arguments will be passed as a hash table rather than as kind of discrete values and stuff. So they tend to be kind of useful for that. I'm going to assign it to a variable because then I can show you that in terms of accessing the hash table, we can use the indexing approach, which makes sense, but we can also use kind of a property syntax approach to read values, or if the property name has a space in it or some other character that wouldn't normally allow it to be a valid property identifier, we can put single quotes around it and access it instead. So far, so good. You can also, go to there. You can also concatenate in the same way. There is a concatenation which effectively merges to the sum of generates a hash table with 2 both sets in it. Sorry, that makes sense. Contents of both. But hash tables by themselves, although as a structure they're quite useful, what kind of elevates them slightly into something is that although kind of dictionaries are sort of ad hoc data structures because it's kind of like an object with a bunch of fields, if we can elevate it and actually make it a real kind of object, which is what PowerShell does, we can sort of, it gets a little bit more syntactic, it's a little bit more consumable kind of in pipelines because it stops being a general purpose structure and starts to look a bit more like an object. And I'll try to show what I mean by that. So there's a type accelerator which turns it into a what's called a PS custom object, which takes the hash table and then creates an object with those attributes. So as you can see, instead of it being rendered as a hash table with keys and values, we now effectively have an object with fields A, B, and C and the associated values. So it now looks a bit more like a sort of a real kind of data structure behind the scenes. And we'll make more use of that later when I start looking at pipelines. We'll use these sort of objects to show a bit more how objects kind of flow through the pipeline. Other type accelerators that are quite useful. There is, so if I have a string and it looks like a date and I want to coerce it into a date, I can use the datetime accelerator. It will be interpreted as a date, and now the default rendering is to display it in that particular format. So that's kind of handy that there's natural conversions to date times. But we can be there are more complicated ones, or should we say more powerful ones, such as the XML accelerator, which I will show if I can get my XML right. Okay, so again, there's a string with a bit of XML into it, which I can parse and turn into effectively a DOM just by using the XML accelerator. which is why we suddenly find that there is a body kind of element. If I assign that to a variable, so that I can do some other stuff with it, I can now say, I can then navigate that DOM by using the names of the elements in the data. So I can say XML body span, and I can get the text in between that term. So it's a really nice way of walking DOMs, and you can do the same thing if you use a JSON parser. Effectively, you get a similar kind of object model, and you can navigate that using the same technique. So it's quite useful. Finally, there's a true and a false, which literals, as you'd expect. Now, unfortunately, the billion-dollar mistake still exists, even in PowerShell, because it's .NET under the covers, and null is a perfectly valid value for reference types in a lot of cases. So null is something we have to deal with. However, in the case of strings, interestingly enough, you don't have to worry about the whole kind of is string null or empty type thing, because PowerShell will do its level best to turn any null string values into an empty string instead. Now, that's quite subtle. What we have here is that effectively that there is empty text. So that gives me a good opportunity to look at the so I'm just using the history to save a bit of typing. So I can use the as I said, reflection is kind of built into because it's .NET under the cover. So I can take any value and then I can call get type name, and I can basically because under the covers everything is an object, it's a .NET object, and every .NET object supports the get type method. I can invoke any underlying methods directly on values and objects in PowerShell, and properties as well, so the name property, in exactly the same way as you would in say C# or another kind of .NET language. So here that shows that the type name is a string. So I could do, just to prove for sake of argument, that that is you'll see that a null value cast to a string is definitely a string value. And just to prove that it's not, that everything doesn't end up as a string by default, if I try and ask for the type on a null reference, then you get the usual invalid, well, you normally get a null reference exception, but in this case we get invalid operation. But just to prove that null actually is, really isn't a thing, there's no special. Okay. One other thing, I've been really careful, which is somewhat unlike me in my typing so far, and I've managed to type everything with the correct case. PowerShell being is like many things in the Microsoft world, is not case sensitive, so I actually don't have to be quite so careful. So you can come up with any casing you like for stuff. A bit kind of for those people used to, again, the sort of VB world, then that is that's something you may either like or not like. But there you go. Everything's generally everything's kind of case sensitive. Comparisons and Max is by default. You can force case comparisons, but it's off by default. One last thing I'll show you around .NET Interop. Not only can you invoke methods, but there's no reason why you can't invoke static methods as well. So rather than me relying on PowerShell to output something, I'm actually going to use the built-in console write line to do it. I particularly like the use of double colons there. It gives me a little warm feeling of familiarity with my C++ days. But effectively, you can invoke a system. The namespace for the type goes in square brackets, and then you can invoke the method on the end. That can be quite useful. There are a number of places, such as things around current working directory, where there's a couple of times where you kind of need that little backdoor. By and large, you generally don't need it, but sometimes there are some places where it's useful. It's probably more useful in the early days when things were less well defined. Let's go. Okay, so back to our hello world. So you might think, well, if you was trying to split string and you're a C++ C# kind of programmer, you think, oh, why didn't I use the split method? And you could definitely use that to split a string based on the default characters, white space. But it's not really idiomatic. The idiomatic way to split a string in PowerShell would be to use one of the operators. In this instance, the split operator. What are some of the other operators that we've got? Well, another very popular one is the ability to do a string replacement. So I can replace the word world with Accu, and lo and behold, there we go. So, it's all very well passing things being kind of objects, but ultimately everything ends up being strings. And if you're trying to interact with other command line tools, then strings still kind of rule the roost. And there's still a lot of formatting shenanigans that you might want to do in terms of generating output for forms and things. So naturally, there's plenty of string stuff. One interesting decision around the replace operator, and in some cases in PowerShell, is that regular expressions are the default, which kind of I think is sometimes a little surprising. Because you end up trying to do a string replacement, you use one of those special characters, and then all of a sudden it kind of doesn't work, and you realise you have to remember that matches for replace are done using a regular expression by default. I mean, it's kind of good that they've embraced regular expressions, but it's one of those things that might end up catching you out. I see there is a question I will come to in a second at the end of the section. That's okay. So replace obviously does a search and replace of that string value. If you just want to see if something is a match, then you can use the match operator, which is often useful. Under the covers, that creates actually a matches object, and you can get all manner of stuff out of it if you actually want to find out more about what happened in the matches. Now, regular expressions are bit marmitey. Some people like them, some people kind of don't like them. I think generally they're quite useful, but for people who are perhaps used to file system kind of based stuff, they tend to perhaps be more used to wildcards. So an alternative to match, which works on regular expressions, is like, which effectively works with file kind of like style wildcards. Of course, with a regular expression, it matches anywhere in the string by default, whereas with a wildcard, that didn't match because I have to effectively allow it to match anything up to W as well. So sometimes when you're kind of moving between the two, it's not necessarily quite so obvious. Let me just have a read of this question from Jez Higgins. Given the syntactic similarity between string blah and system console write line, is the type accelerator actually calling a constructor? I honestly don't know what happens kind of under the covers in terms of that, or whether often there are the accelerators. There are kind of, there's more than that. There might be something cleverer, a mapping somewhere in PowerShell. There's quite a few little bits that to do with models and meta models that allow mapping. So it's possible that it's a bit more complicated, or at least there is some mapping from string, for a particular type. So I couldn't ask what's going on under the covers. I couldn't tell you what's kind of going on under the covers. I'll probably find out. Hopefully that suitably fast to answer your question. Carrying on with, let me just clear my screen. The opposite, of course, of split is to join. For a long time, there was there wasn't the join operator, and you had to use the ugly string join static method on string class to kind of do that. Whereas now we can join strings using the built-in operator. Right, okay, so a brief look at, I mentioned string interpolation at the beginning, so I'm just going to explore that a little bit more. So I'm going to assign effectively the two portions of our hello world string to two variables, one called H and one called W. You'll notice how I can use a semicolon to put stuff on a line. Statements end in a semicolon. It's largely optional, and you only really need it if you're going to concatenate statements. Again, you should be pretty used to that if you do that in Bash. That would be quite normal to you. So if I wanted to do, let me start with the failing case first, which is to prove that with single quotes, I get the literal string HW, which is kind of not what I wanted. If I replace the single quotes with double quotes, it now expands it, and that's classic string interpolation, as you'd expect. That's, I would say, is probably the most useful way to format strings, because obviously the variable names give you a good idea of where placeholders are. The old classic printf style placeholders are kind of not quite as easy to grok, but of course, because it's .NET under the covers, we have access to the sort of printf formatting stuff through the format operator. So instead, what I can do is I can use the classic right line style formatting and pass in my two variables, effectively my parameters, and lo and behold, I get a formatted string. Less useful for strings because, as I said, it's with text you probably can be a little bit more explicit in your format string, and I can never remember any of the formatting styles for .NET. I always have to look at them. But here, if I had a double value and I wanted to format it in a really bizarrely leading, trailing zero fashion, I can always drop down and kind of do that. That's quite useful. Grand. Okay, so enough of that stuff. So let's move on to Commandlets. Commandlets is a term that PowerShell uses for effectively its sort of built-in tools, if you like, commands. Although commands kind of are it's a sort of a wider concept because they could be native commands like git.exe, or it could be something that's kind of built in. And a commandlet can be implemented as a script. It could be implemented in a .NET class. It could be part of a module. So there are sort of different ways that they can have it. But commandlet kind of, I think, implies that sort of built-in, often nature of sort of the little classes where it could be even as small as a sort of a filter, which we'll see an example from. But it's a sort of different term. You'll notice that I'm going to jump the gun a bit on the pipeline section by just showing if I can type correctly. Format wide minus auto size. Oops, there we go. Right, there. So that's kind of an example pipeline. You'll see that the common format is verb noun. So in get verb, obviously get is the verb, and in this case, the verb is the noun. That's not at all confusing, is it? Probably should have picked a sort object. So everything is a kind of that kind of verb noun naming convention, and arguments are passed with a single dash rather than so very kind of, I guess, go-like. And they again, this is all kind of case insensitive. And this particular pipeline will basically show you the list of verbs. So it's quite opinionated, PowerShell. There was originally a very limited set of verbs. They didn't stop you using other verbs, but the idea was part of the sort of the consistency and the discoverability came about by effectively limiting the vocabulary to very common sets. So, for instance, there were very common pairs. If you see a close, because you probably had already spotted somewhere around here, where is it? There is an open to go with a close. There is a send, and to go with that, receive. Similarly, you'll also notice there's a connect and a disconnect. read and write. So there's often a lot of obvious kind of pairs that, and they're trying to obviously keep the same meanings kind of where possible. Obviously, not everything kind of fits into the kind of the yin and the yang style. So there are a few kind of oddballs like optimize. I mean, what would the opposite of optimize be? Pessimize, I guess. But I mean, I can't imagine anybody wanting to write a pessimize or something commandlet unless they were doing something bizarre like testing. So there are a few kind of perhaps things that don't necessarily have a counterpart within them. That also means that get is probably somewhat overused, which is much to my annoyance, because I try to get people to stop using get and using anything else besides, like make. I mean, at least there is build, and so at least you've got sort of find and kind of build in there as well, but and format as in place of, but still not the same rich vocabulary that perhaps we might like. PowerShell is often labelled as being incredibly verbose because if you'd seen that and you were used to, a Unix command line, you might think, well, that's crazy kind of verbose. Got all that typing, even with autocorrect, it's quite kind of painful. Well, there are various things to save your keyboard. There are aliases. People tend to not use aliases in examples because obviously if you're trying to teach somebody or you're trying to your script and you want to share it, the idea is that you generally write things longhand. The only time you should ever use aliases is effectively on your own machine, perhaps when you're concocting some fancy kind of one-liner. So for instance, salt object has salt as a natural alias, and format wide has FW. So other things that we can do, though, for instance, are arguments can be labelled or marked as mandatory and positional. So an argument that you can say that, for instance, if an argument appears at a particular position, then it's assumed to be a particular argument. So in this case, the property has position 0. So if it finds in a 0 indexed array, if it finds a value at position 0, it is assumed to be property. So there we go. We don't have to write the word property. And similarly, switches only have to be unique. So given that there are no other switches that start A for format wide, I can get away with just, so that shortens it immensely. There is no alias for get verb, so I had to spell that out longhand. But hopefully you'll see that that is half the size of what it was. And so it's not quite as verbose, perhaps, as some people have made out, but obviously it is a little bit kind of more verbose. As an example, you cannot combine things. So whereas on Unix you could do -RF because they are single kind of letter switches, unfortunately you can't do that. The best that you can do in PowerShell is -R space -FO, and that's because there is more than one parameter that starts F, so you have to disambiguate it with FO. But that's still reasonably close, but not, you don't have everything that perhaps you're used to. Okay, so commandlets. We're going to move on to functions now. So I'm going to write a function, which actually we derive with the function, and our function is, you're not going to believe this, but it's going to output hello world, because let's face it, when you've got a theme, you go with it. Okay, so that declares a function, returns a value hello world. That probably seems quite obvious. And when I invoke it like any command line tool. Effectively, commandlets are invoked without, without parenthesis, and functions look just like commandlets, so you invoke them kind of the same way. So now, one thing that kind of surprised me, certainly when I first started with PowerShell, but wouldn't surprise people who probably do a lot of other scripting languages and polyglots, is the fact that you don't need the return. It's just a little bit of syntactic sugar to make those of us who write C, C++, and C# feel a little bit easier about things. Ultimately, the return doesn't have to be there, because the output from any function pipeline is a stream of values. it's never kind of a single scale. Even a scalar value is still effectively kind of a stream of values, of which there is kind of just one. So really, what this kind of looks like is it might be easy to grok if you think that that is really kind of what's sort of going on, is that as part of my function, I am sending hello world to some output stream, and I am capturing that. Somebody in the comments did mention that there is an out default. If you wanted to do it in a pipeline kind of way, that would look kind of like that. But ultimately, these are all kind of just more verbose ways of doing the same thing, which is to say that any value which isn't directed to any specific stream, like a file or a socket or something, effectively becomes a return value, and there can be more than one of them. So where are we? Okay, so format greeting. Let's make it a little more functions. It's always nice if they take arguments, and naturally you can do that. So we can change our function to take there. Now we take name as an argument, and we can say hello. And if we run that, lo and behold, we don't get anything out because effectively name is empty. I didn't pass an argument for the name parameter, so it just becomes an empty string. The REPL is naturally very forgiving about things, but at the same time, depending on whether that's a good or a bad thing, we can do stuff about it to make it a little bit to warn you about some kind of common mistakes. But yeah, it works without any kind of argument. So if I put an argument in, remember to use space rather than parenthesis, lo and behold, it works. So maybe to make it a little bit less curious, what I could do is I could give it a default value, like so, and then when I invoke it, then default value takes hold. I think that's all reasonably kind of, hopefully that's sort of reasonably obvious. Behaves pretty much like functions you would expect. But let me come back to this business about generating effectively values being values that aren't kind of sent anywhere automatically being part of the output. So what I'm going to do this time is I am going to create a function called generate, and effectively it's just going to create two values, and those two values kind of don't go anywhere. So as a consequence, when I invoke it, I get those two outputs. And so this is kind of a nice way of generating output. So generating kind of a stream of objects. In this case, it's an array of strings, which I can then obviously pass into a pipeline, which we'll see later, and do kind of other stuff with. What that does mean is that what can end up happening is you end up writing a function, you don't send it somewhere, and then all of a sudden you sit there and you've got this weird output on your screen, or things don't quite work, and then what you discover is that you've maybe forgotten to assign a value to a variable, and what happens is instead of it being assigned to the variable, it becomes part of the output, and then effectively it propagates all the way up and then kind of appears on the screen. That can be a bit of an odd moment to start with, but you kind of soon get used to that. If we're going to do functions, I think it's important that we do functions. We do the classic addition operator because so I've got a nice function called add, and so if I give it the arguments 2 and 3, I should get 5, and I do. That's great. Okay. So what would happen then if I gave it parentheses? So I said that you shouldn't give them parentheses. If I do use them and accidentally invoke it like a method, what happens? Well, it does that, which might kind of seem a little bit bizarre. Effectively, what 2, 3 is an array of two values, which obviously with a parenthesis kind of basically passes a single argument to add with an array. So effectively left is set to the value 2 and then the value 3. Because functions effectively are designed to be used in pipelines and expect kind of multiple values. So PowerShell tries to turn collections into sequences for kind of pipeline use, which kind of makes sense. So effectively what we've done is we've invoked, effectively it's the same as that, but it wasn't as obvious. And because write is a value, it's an empty string, and that gets coerced into a 0, everything kind of seems to kind of work, which is a little bit, in this case, a bit awkward. There is a mode that you can turn on. It's called strict mode. And what it will do is it enables certain things that behaviors that are likely to kind of point out when you've tripped up. So if you was to try and invoke that with strict mode on, then it would warn you that you've tried to invoke a commandlet as if it was a method, and you'll be some the wiser. As we'll see in the script section, it's good to kind of have that one by default. What I can do, there's one way I can make that easier, is to give ourselves a type. And now I can give those, so if I try and provide something that isn't a type, then I get an argument telling me that the argument couldn't be converted to a value, couldn't be converted to an int. And now, rather than trying to do either string concatenation, which is we saw at the beginning, it will try and do what it thinks is the right thing. Okay, so one last point to bring in about functions is that functions, if you've ever done awk, you'll know that when you write something in awk, you can have a begin function or a begin block, and then there's the block that gets executed for every line in a pipeline, and then there's kind of an end block. And functions in PowerShell under the covers actually have the same behavior. There's a begin, a process, and an end block. It just happens to be that generally when we write a function, it's assumed that you are writing it from the perspective of as a kind of the one to be done. It's not the begin or end, but it's assumed to be before. So as a consequence, so here, I have written a function called isEven, but the difference is that effectively the only difference is that I've used this magic placeholder, which says that rather than having a sort of a named argument for my function, it says that when this function is invoked with many values, one after the other, then $_ is just a placeholder for that kind of one value. So what I can do is if I create an array, again, I'm jumping the gun a bit with the pipelines, then you'll see that isEven will be invoked 4 times with 1, with 2, with 3, and with 4. So filters are just, but they are, just say that a filter is not anything special. It's just a documentatory thing to say that something is a filter, maybe rather than a function. Okay. Right, and so on to pipelines, which is pretty much the kind of the big part. Right, I'm going to, in true Blue Peter tradition, I am going to, here is something I prepared earlier. Okay, so I have here, so I have declared a variable people, and people has an empty array. So I've just basically created an empty array so that plus equals would work. And then to my array, I've added 3 people, Charlotte, Chris, and Isaac. They have an age and their pet of choice. So I have effectively an array with 3 people. Again, I've used the PS custom object so that effectively these things, rather than just being raw hash tables, are actually internally objects with attributes called name, age, and pet, which is why they display nicely, and they will play ball nicely with a pipeline, and things will just work kind of automatically. Okay, just to show you using the get a reflection, you can see that it's an array of objects. People is an array of objects, that's right. People, you'd expect it to be a collection. If I pick the first item, because it's an array I can index, you'll see that the type of item in the array is our PS custom object. and if I display that value, you'll see that it is an object with 3 fields, name, age, and pet. There we go. Okay, so the default, if I just send an object like that to the output, by default I'll get this table with values, and the columns represent the attributes and the values as rows. And that's effectively the default kind of output format. So that would be the same as me doing format table, which if I wanted to save myself some fingers is the same as FT. Okay, but that's not the only format. Obviously, sometimes when you get a table, it sometimes is quite wide. PowerShell will try and squeeze a certain amount of columns on, and some models have default values to display, and then other values don't get display, and then you kind of have to fight with it a bit to get it to display everything, but it's too wide for the output. In which case, maybe format list would be a better output, which gives you each item one after the other and lists the attribute. Once again, the default for that, the alias for that is FL, so that's quite useful. I did mention something which I won't show just because of the actual output, just because I have to switch the output Zoom presentation window. But there's a thing called grid view, and there's one of the things that PowerShell, being sort of .NET based, obviously you can create GUI applications with PowerShell. There's nothing to stop you creating windows and stuff. So if you're used to WinForm programming, you can create WinForm applications from PowerShell. And the grid view kind of gives you this sort of Excel-like view with the kind of the filter columns like you'd have in an Excel spreadsheet, and you can kind of pick items. So if you have like a really large kind of data set that you pull in, maybe a CSV file, you can pipe that to the grid view, and then you can kind of look at it in a nice kind of visual way. And that may be easier to explore initially than trying to sort of do it in a terminal with kind of limited output. As I say, that's made its way into PowerShell 7. Okay, what if I want my data in a different format? So at the moment, my data is a set of objects. So what if I wanted it in JSON? Well, I can just pipe it to the convert to JSON commandlet, and lo and behold, I have text JSON. I could also output it as CSV if I wanted to. Because it's objects that are being passed through the pipeline, it automatically knows in both cases what to use for the names of the attributes, or in the case of CSV, it knows what to use for the names for the columns because it can see that in the data, and it can naturally quote things correctly. I mean, it chooses to quote all values, but it could decide not to quote strings that didn't need them, for instance. So that's convert to CSV. Now, if I wanted to save that to a file, then obviously I could take the converted CSV file and then I could write to a file called, I'll call that people.csv. There we go, and that's now written to a file. Now, sometimes with large data, that gets a little bit on the, you end up passing objects tend to be quite a large data set, so converting it into text, right, to CSV, lines of CSV and stuff can be, and then sort of trying to pipe them out is quite an expensive way to do it in some formats. So luckily there are, in some cases, some shortcuts. So for instance, export CSV is the same as convert to CSV and then kind of out file. So there's some shortcuts which can make a difference kind of performance-wise with larger data sets. So that's kind of, as you can see, there's different ways of outputting and formatting data. So not everybody now has to write a CSV output and a JSON output, and there's an XML one as well, naturally. So they're only written once, effectively. Right. So that's kind of outputs. Now, maybe though, we actually want to kind of explore our data in our terminal, and what we can do is, for instance, maybe we've got a big data set, and the classic thing that we want to do is we use, say, head and tail, because we want to look at the first few items or the last few items. So select is the tool for this. So I can say select the first item. Again, that's a bit on the verbose side, so I will shorten it to select. If I want to see the last item in my set, then I can do select the last one. Alternatively, if I want to, what I can do is if I want to skip an item, I want to see the middle item, I would say skip the first item and then just return me one item. So I can do all that in turn. So that kind of allows me to navigate it. If you use the SQL, that's kind of the select, so saying select top 10 or whatever. It's a similar kind of thing. And obviously, if you sort data before and after, then that affects perhaps what kind of comes out. So that's one particular use for select, is effectively limiting kind of the data set. Okay, but probably what we want to do is we want to search our data set. We want to go and find, maybe we want to find if something exists within it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to have a look at my extensive data set that I couldn't manually search because that'd be ridiculous, is to see whether somebody called Isaac exists in my data set. And lo and behold, for that, I can use where object. And there we go. It will look for basically all the people in the pipeline will be fed in one after the other into where object, which will apply the predicate $name equals Isaac, and any that return true will get passed on to the next phase of the pipeline, which there isn't one, so naturally it ends out kind of on the output. Once again, typing where object is a bit over the top, so we can kind of there are some kind of shortcuts. So, for instance, one of them is that where object aliases to where. Now, it's very common that you often want to do a where you want to match one field with a single operator, a comparison operator, and a single value. So I can shorten it to where just the name and the comparison operator. If I want to be really terse and confuse people, then I can use a question mark instead and really reduce it. But now we're beginning to look a bit more like Perl, some might say. But maybe that's not a bad thing. Okay, let's go a little bit less terse. Yes, so comparison operators, show them. So they're kind of similar to the batch file ones. So there's minus EQ for equals, there's greater than, less than is LT. I could use, so it's EQ for so greater than, there's less than or equal to. You can use what I could do is say if I had two people to match, then I can say something and something else, or not, Boolean and stuff. So you've got usual kind of sets of operators. The reason why, if you notice, if that was, if I was trying to match the age, for instance, so if what is age is, say, if I wanted to find somebody who was an adult, maybe greater than equal to 18. Why is it that, not that? Well, being a shell, these tend to be involved in operators. The less than and greater than signs tend to be used for redirection, and I think that's so ingrained in people's heads. They were kept as operators instead, and so they stuck to. So they stuck to that. They stuck to the dash kind of style operators, which kind of makes them more consistent with perhaps with split and join, that kind of stuff. So where were we? Oh yes, okay, right. So when I do that, unfortunately, I get the whole Isaac object out, and that's maybe not what I want. Maybe all I'm really after is what his pet is. So I can do that. I can select and pass a set of properties, and I can just have just the properties I'm interested in. Maybe I'm just interested in the age and the pet, and that's fine. I can provide a list of properties. That's fine. As you might expect, PowerShell really wants to keep things as object as long as possible and only throw information when it's absolutely necessary. So if I use, just to show you that that is not just a sort of a string pair or something, I can use getMember, which will take an object and will dump all of its members. And you will be able to see that. So you can see that this is a PS custom object. It has the usual equals hash code boilerplate stuff from object, and then it has one note property tagged on the end. So it's still an object, but effectively it's an object with a single property. So that's quite useful. getMember is quite a useful kind of debugging thing when you're looking at stuff and you've not quite realised what what you've got. If I did want just the property itself, the pet, which I know is a string, I could use expand property, and that will take that one property and effectively, rather than turning it into an object, we'll try and drill down into it and get the value of that property instead. Okay, right, where are we? Okay, something else we might want to do is we could do some aggregations. So for instance, there's a thing called measure object, and by default that gives me a count. Or I can find the sum of their ages. I might want to find the average of their age. Oops, that wasn't quite right, was it? I can find the average as well at the same time. So that's some kind of nice little aggregations. And again, I can, if I just want if I just wanted one attribute of it, I can just select the sum, and away you go, rather than taking kind of the whole object. Right, final part on, so one last little bit just to do on aggregations. Possibly it's quite useful. I'm going to add, unfortunately that data set is far too unique. I need something with some duplicates in, so I've added 2 more people who both happen to have fish as a pet. So that's good. So something I can do with, there's a thing called group object. So what I can do is I can pass my people into group object, pass it a field. So in this case, I'm going to pass it the pet, and it will basically turn that into kind of a sort of a hash table with or associative kind of array where it's based on pet, and then there's a list of items, and then count kind of isn't stored. It's sort of a derived property, but you can see that they all have under the covers. They're still all it's an array of name to an object. So what can I do with that? Well, what I might want to say is, well, I'm only really interested in people who have more than one pet. So I can do that, which would give me, so basically group pets and then find those where the count is greater than 1. That's good. Now, this is where expand property comes back in again. At the moment, the group element, if I pick the group element, what I end up with is this property, effectively this object with multiple other objects, but it hasn't been expanded in the same way that a sequence has. So what I have to do is I have to tell it, in this instance, to expand the property. And now what I get back is the underlying objects again. So I've managed to filter out those who have more. Another example of output. This is great. I've now got my data set, list of people. What I'd really like to do is to convert it to HTML. And I'm going to give that a title of pets, because that's my report. And then, lo and behold, I've created an HTML document with those where it's used a table and can output. And naturally, I can, if I want to keep that, I can use out file to save that as report.html and email it to somebody. There we go. The opposite of there is an alias. The opposite of out file is get content. If I wanted to read a file, just in case, just to prove that that really did go to a file. There we go. There's the kind of the HTML done. Right. Okay. How are we doing? Oh gosh, 20 past. Okay. Oh, question. I see there's a question here. How does all this interact with invoking X's and parsing the output? Okay, so everything that you've kind of seen there, where you have pipes, those pipes and those tools, those commandlets could be native executables as well. I can give you an example. So, for instance, PS is shows you a process list. That's the built-in one. The equivalent command line one is task list, which is the original kind of command line tool. And I can still invoke that. I can also, because if I wanted to show the first 5, I can still use head, which is from the GNU on Windows distribution, so I can still do that. I can also use the traditional command line grep as well if I wanted to look for PowerShell, for instance. And I can compose things exactly as I would before in terms of command lines, awk, cut, all of that stuff is still available. Effectively, the pipes here is just piping an object stream, and that object stream in this case is effectively just strings rather than simple objects. So you could kind of mix and match things. So I could mix that up and say, so if I wanted to mix, task list in this instance is bear with me, that would be, oh sorry, I need to do that as it's not a property, and what did I get wrong there? Oh, see, because it's a line of text, I have to remember to match lines of text. I don't have to remember, whereas before I would match a particular name, so I had to remember. And there we go. That is effectively the same. Is that not the same as what I had before? Yes, it's the same as what I had before. So you can do the same things that you can, but you effectively lose that done. You effectively lose that behavior. Okay, so that's that. I'm just one last. There was something I thought would be useful to cover briefly. Is error handling. Let me share change. So I have PowerShell ISE up here, which is the original. Hopefully you can see this here. This is the. Hopefully this is the. Yes, this is the original IDE that it kind of came with, and you can see that it's got, you can have scripts open, and there's tools and debugging options, and there's a command palette that appears out the side that shows you there we go, on the side, so you can see all the commandlets and stuff. And that was kind of part of that, makes things easier for people to hopefully kind of adopt. So I have a script up here. Ideally, we could run these and go through the different options, but the key, one of the things that's maybe a little bit odd or a little bit new is this idea of terminating and non-terminating errors. So, for instance, I have a script here where I will create a directory and let me just called debug, and then the easiest way to describe terminating and non-terminating errors is with a command like remove. Now, the debug directory exists, but the release directory doesn't exist. The question is do I want remove to try and delete what it can and carry on to the end, or do I want remove to fail fast the moment it finds an error? By default, ultimately, it will delete what it can. It will delete what it can, and then at the end of it, you'll get some diagnostic output, but basically it won't kind of fail, which can be a little unfortunate. What we can do is we can change its behavior with error action. We can say instead stop, which would mean that no matter what the defaults are, I want you to stop straight away as soon as you reach the first error. And if we look at the top of the script, you'll see that the default, what I tend to set as the default is error action preference stop. So I like things to fail fast. The default behavior is a bit like bash before you've used set -e. If you don't use set -e, then things kind of carry on. I think it's good practice to use that by default, set -e-u-x-o pipe fail. So you have all that on. This is kind of the equivalent, and it will cause things to break. So it will cause things to stop as soon as possible, and then we can handle errors differently. So that means that if we want things to fail, maybe we want things to fail locally rather than abort the whole script. And we have a number of different choices here. So one option is a trap. Effectively, that's declared anywhere within the scope. And if an error occurs, the trap will fail you can specify it a bit like a catch handler to pick particular error types, and it will catch just that error, process just that error. So you can have multiple traps with different errors, but this default one here, and I've said break here, which basically means abort, and go effectively abort the script. I can use continue, which would basically just ignore the error, but the default is to emit a diagnostic and then carry on with the next statement after. Kind of a bit like on error resume next, for those who don't. Another option is to use the try kind of catch finally construct, which you might be used to from obviously languages that throw exceptions. You can throw exceptions in PowerShell and kind of deal with them that way. And then the other another kind of option is if we decided that we wanted to kind of carry on, potentially we can, and we don't want to sully the output. What happens is when errors occur, they accumulate inside this $error environment variable, which is basically a round, is a circular buffer of the last n errors. It's like maximum error count, I think is the top. So effectively you can run stuff, and then you can look at things at the end and say, oh, right, did any errors occur? And if so, you can then triage them and do kind of something about them. So that's kind of another way, is to force commands to continue if it's possible, and then you can kind of expect the errors afterwards. So there's a number of different options there in terms of how you kind of deal with errors. And the last thing I was hoping to cover, I think we have a minute or so, is scripts. Just to show you what an example script looks like, some of the bits that you have. Top of a script can contain a documentation block. So you have synopsis, examples, detailed descriptions, parameters and stuff. So you've got lots of nice big documentation doc, a la kind of Doxygen, Autodoc, that kind of thing. And effectively, when you use them, because PowerShell has get help is the equivalent of man. So if you do man and the command, or get help minus question mark, which I will show here. So if I do example script minus question mark to invoke the help, then you will see that here you kind of get the output and the synopsis, example output script name. It will also show you the argument usage, and if you do full, it will kind of fill those things kind of in as well. So you get all of that for free just by kind of like documenting your commandlet, and then it looks no different to a built-in one. Commandlet binding came in kind of after the beginning, and it adds the set of common parameters. So this common parameters block here, that we see here, there are common parameters like minus verbose, minus what if, which is a great way of testing stuff. Verbose bumps the output level up, error action, that kind of stuff. So commandlet binding basically enables all of that. Again, more stuff that you get for free, and it just fits in kind of a lot nicer. I declared a parameter block, so we have parameters could be as simple as literally just $argument by itself, but here I've given the argument a type, so that'll help. So type conversions will get thrown out earlier. I've given it a default value here, and then I've added some attributes. Again, like the commandlet binding, to say that it's not mandatory, and if somebody provides the command, if somebody invokes it with a value at position 0, then assume that that is the argument, and that's what appears there. Set strict mode, I mentioned, that's kind of the same as set minus u and in bash, or option explicit in Visual Basic. It will tell you things like variables where you've misspelt the variable name and it's not defined. Very useful, so I tend to put that on first. Error action preference stop, I like my things to fail fast by default and handle recovery manually. And then the last bit at the end here is just an example to show that you can use pretty color in your output of Hello World. Excellent. Right, let me switch back to the slides just for a second to say, okay, if you're going to dabble in PowerShell, there are some gotchas. I won't pretend that it's all roses. Most things kind of, I think work. Things that these are some of the things that still catch me out even to this day, unfortunately. So yeah, there are some gotchas. empty sequences. If you do ls on a folder that has no files in it, you will not get an empty collection. You'll end up with null. And that basically allows the sort of the not operator to work in the same way that in C++ you can say if not on a pointer, because it kind of decays to a sort of a pointer and a zero value. So if you try and invoke a method, a .NET method on it, you end up invoking method on a null pointer rather than invoking a method on an empty collection. That can bite you. Arguments should only have parentheses if it's a .NET method call, not when you invoke commandlets. That's something you kind of just get used to. I mean, most stuff is now native to PowerShell, so there's less dropping back to .NET, so I think it's less of an issue. A pair of parentheses denotes a script block. So in some cases, like where you have if and then a block, if you comment the if out but leave the block, it doesn't execute the code in the block by default like it would in, say, C or C++ or C#. It actually creates a lambda object but doesn't get invoked. That threw me a few times. And there's this thing called the call operator, which is the ampersand, which you would use in some cases to make sure the code actually kind of executes. But that's sort of a bit more esoteric. Native error tools. So when you invoke native commands, sort.exe, tasklist.exe, they don't play by the same error handling rules. So the error action preference doesn't affect them. So if they fail, the script won't stop. You have to still inspect the $, which again comes as a bashism, or a $, last exit code, which if you read in batch files is the same as error level effectively. You do still have to check those to be 0. To handle them. Incredibly annoying, but PowerShell has this other thing that it says that if any output occurs on std error, then it kind of assumes that something has failed. That can be quite annoying because a lot of tools dump diagnostic information like version information and stuff to std error, and PowerShell might think that that's actually, if you use those without sort of inspecting the error object, or redirecting std error out, you can there can be quite things fail, and it's just because that's a convention that nobody else follows, but unfortunately PowerShell does. Hash tables, when you pass a hash table into a pipe, you have to use get enumerator. I don't know why you have to do this, but it won't work the way you think it does. But I think that because most things tend to be objects, not raw hash tables that you pass in or arrays, it doesn't kind of affect you perhaps as much in practice as perhaps yes, but it is something that you have to remember. Calling batch files is really easy. You just run the batch file. What's not as obvious is that obviously under the covers, it will run command.exe and will run the batch file in a separate process. So if you set any environment variables in your batch file, they won't be reflected in the parent. When you're running build scripts that do this still catches me out, and I run the batch file that sets some variables, and then I wonder why on earth it hasn't happened. It's because PowerShell does not actually parse a batch file and run it. It just runs command.exe as if it was any other process. So just as it doesn't work for any other process, but for some reason I feel like it should work, but it just doesn't. And the last one, out file, unfortunately, writes to UTF-16 by default, which again is an interesting choice. Perhaps UTF, 20 years later, UTF-8 might have been a better choice without a bomb, but unfortunately it doesn't. So that means if you use the shell redirection, you end up with a UTF-16 file, and unless you add minus encoding, and then maybe you suddenly find that your other tools don't read it correctly because all of a sudden there's all these zeros everywhere in the file and it just doesn't behave. That is something that can kind of catch you out. But of course, if you read the file back in with PowerShell, you wouldn't notice any difference because it's all transparent. It's more of one of those interop kind of things. A couple of books that are probably worth reading. Windows PowerShell in Action by Bruce Payette. I hope I pronounced his name right. He's one of the original creators of PowerShell. Really good book, really kind of in-depth, lots of good stuff in there. I learned PowerShell from reading it, and I think modern versions are equally as good. And then more recently, if you have questions like, why did they use the backtick instead of a backslash like everybody else in the world? Shell of an Idea is about the history of PowerShell, and it gives you some of the design decisions they wrote. I've only just started reading it, so I pretend I'm knowledgeable a bit about the early days when all I really did was cryptic from this book. But it's kind of an interesting book. And that's really it. Questions? Oh, there's another question here. How do you read a file as sudo for a commandlet? Okay, so although you have a redirect out operator, there is no need for a pipe in, and that is because actually this is I suppose this is one of those things that people often use cat and then pipe that to say grep, for instance, as a way of searching a file, and that's often seen as a bit of an anti-pattern because, of course, you can just provide the file name to grep and do it directly. In PowerShell, actually, the idea is that you don't need the kind of the stood-in approach because you just stuff it into a pipeline. So you just cat it, stick it into a pipeline, and kind of away you go. So rather than having commandlets have the ability to read from files as well as kind of read from other streams, instead of having to have, again, more boilerplate code, everything just generally assumes that it reads from a pipeline by default, and then only the few commandlets that actually need to read or write files, so a bit like the convert to CSV, there's a convert from CSV which takes string data and turns it into objects by parsing CSV file. Those don't have to worry about having to need to read and write files because the read and writing of file is handled by other commandlets, so it just avoids more stuff. So if you're looking for that behavior, it doesn't exist. It's the idiom is that you use get content or maybe import CSV or something to do it instead. I hope that answers your question. Done. So that's me done. I'm kind of a bit over time. I will go and find a table in the in Remo, I guess, and probably on one of the higher level floors. I feel like floor 4, table 2, given the amount of use of 42 I've had, would be a good place to go and hide out. But if anybody wants to kind of ask me a question and stuff, then I guess you can find me. I'll go and disappear there in a minute. And that is it.